The morning I finally got the promotion I had worked 11 years for, my wife looked at the certificate in my hands, laughed once through her nose, and said the words that would end up rearranging the rest of my life: "Don't get excited, Grant. Anyone could do your job. You just happened to be standing there the longest." I stood in our kitchen holding a piece of paper that represented over a decade of 6 a.m. alarms, missed birthdays, and swallowed pride, and I felt something inside my chest quietly close its door. Before we go further into what happened next, I want to ask you something. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, in the quiet kind of courage it takes to keep showing up for people even when they don't see your worth, then please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one mean more when we go through them together as a community, so if any part of what you're about to hear speaks to you, let us know you're here. Now, let me tell you about the spring everything in my life quietly came apart, and how, without ever raising my voice, I let my life answer the question my wife had already decided she knew. My name is Grant Whitfield, and at the time all of this happened, I was 44 years old, living in a modest brick house on Aldermore Lane in a town called Belhaven, the kind of place with one good bakery, a hardware store that had been there since before I was born, and neighbors who still waved from their porches. I had worked at Corrigan Steel Fabrication since I was 26 years old, starting on the floor as a welding technician, learning the machines, learning the men who ran them, learning what it meant to stay late without being asked because a customer needed a part by morning. Over 11 years I had worked my way from the floor into logistics, then into operations coordination, and finally, after 2 years of quietly redesigning our shipping and scheduling systems on my own time, into a role that management had never had before: Director of Operations. It came with a corner office that had actual sunlight in it, a raise that would let us finally fix the roof, and, more than anything, it came with the feeling that after 11 years of being invisible in a company of 300 people, someone had finally looked at me and said, "We see what you built." My wife, Denise, and I had been married for 16 years. We met at a community college night class, both of us tired from our day jobs, both of us trying to become something more than what our families expected of us. In those early years, Denise had a fire in her that I loved fiercely. She wanted to open her own interior design studio, and for a long time I believed in that dream as much as she did. I picked up extra shifts so she could take unpaid design internships. I learned to cook because she was always at client meetings. I told everyone who would listen that my wife was going to be somebody someday, and I meant it with my whole chest. But somewhere in the last 6 or 7 years, something in Denise had gone quiet and then gone bitter, the way water left too long in a glass turns stale without you noticing until you take a sip and flinch. Her design studio never took off the way she'd hoped. 2 attempts folded within their first years. She took a steady job at a furniture retailer instead, managing a showroom, and though she never said it outright, I think some part of her never forgave the world, or maybe never forgave herself, for the dream that didn't happen. And somewhere in that quiet bitterness, I think she had also stopped forgiving me for the parts of my life that did. We had 2 children. Our son, Theo, was 14, tall and awkward in the way boys are at that age, more interested in his skateboard and his headphones than in much else, but with a soft heart he tried hard to hide. Our daughter, Ruthie, was 9, still young enough to run and hug my legs when I came home, still young enough to believe her father hung the moon, which was a belief I clung to more than I probably should have, because it was the one place in my life where I still felt unquestionably good at something. The morning of the promotion had actually started beautifully. I remember waking up before my alarm, unable to sleep from nerves, watching the gray Belhaven sky slowly turn gold outside our bedroom window. My boss, a steady, no-nonsense man named Foster Callum who had run Corrigan Steel for nearly 20 years, had told me the Friday before that Monday's meeting would be, in his words, worth putting on a good tie for. I hadn't told Denise. I wanted to surprise her. I wanted, if I'm honest, to see her face light up the way it used to when we were young and broke and dreaming, back when good news between us used to mean something. The meeting itself was simple. Foster stood in front of the senior staff, thanked me for what he called the quiet backbone work nobody claps for, and handed me a folder with my new title, my new salary, and a framed certificate that Corrigan gave out for milestone promotions, an old company tradition. My co-workers clapped. A man named Desmond Price, who ran the machine floor and who I had known since my first week 11 years earlier, hugged me so hard he nearly knocked the folder out of my hands. I drove home that afternoon with the windows down, feeling, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, like the version of myself I had always hoped to become. I walked into the kitchen holding that folder, that ridiculous framed certificate under my arm, my heart open like a door I hadn't locked in years. Denise was standing at the counter chopping vegetables for dinner, still in her work blazer, her hair pulled back the way it was when she was tired but hadn't allowed herself to admit it yet. I set the certificate down gently on the counter beside the cutting board and said, "I got it. Director of Operations. Effective this week." I remember I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. Denise glanced at the certificate. She read the words on it. And then she laughed, not cruelly exactly, more with the exhausted, flat amusement of someone who had heard a joke they didn't find funny the first 6 times either. "Don't get excited, Grant," she said, setting the knife down. "Anyone could do your job. You just happened to be standing there the longest." Then she picked the knife back up and kept chopping, as if she hadn't just taken 11 years of my life and folded it into a paper airplane and thrown it in the trash. I want you to understand something about that moment, because I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since. It wasn't the sting of the insult that broke something in me. I could have absorbed an insult. It was the certainty in her voice. She wasn't angry. She wasn't lashing out from a bad day. She said it the way you'd say the sky is blue, a fact so obvious it barely warranted her attention while she cut carrots. In that flatness, I understood that she had believed this about me for a long time, that this wasn't the first time the thought had crossed her mind, only the first time she'd said it out loud, and saying it out loud had cost her nothing at all. I didn't argue. I want to be honest with you, because I think a lot of us, in our worst moments, imagine that we would have said something sharp and true and cutting right back, something that would have made her feel 1/10 of what I felt standing there. But I didn't. I picked the certificate back up, walked it quietly into my home office, a small converted room off the garage that used to be a place I went to unwind, and I set it on the shelf, and I sat down in my desk chair, and I stared at the wall for a long time. Theo knocked on the door 20 minutes later to ask if I wanted to watch the game with him, and I said not tonight, buddy, and he shrugged the easy shrug of a 14-year-old and left, and I sat there a while longer, feeling the strangest, quietest kind of grief, the kind that doesn't come from losing someone, but from finally, clearly seeing someone who has been standing in front of you the whole time. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was angry, but because I was doing math in my head, uncomfortable math, the kind where you start adding up small moments you'd filed away as nothing and realize they form a pattern you'd been too tired, or too loyal, or too scared, to look at directly. I remembered the time I'd told her about redesigning the shipping software at Corrigan, staying up 3 nights in a row teaching myself a logistics program on my own time, and she'd said, "That's nice, but did you remember Ruthie has a dentist appointment Thursday?" I remembered the time I'd been asked to speak at a regional manufacturing conference about supply chain efficiency, my first real public recognition, and she'd said she couldn't come because the showroom had inventory that weekend, and when I got home with a small plaque they'd given me, she'd put it in a drawer, so it wouldn't clutter the mantel. None of these moments, alone, had felt like anything. Marriages are made of small moments. But laid end to end that night, in the dark, they formed a long, quiet hallway, and at the end of it was a door with today's words written on it. The next morning I went to work as normal, sat in my new office with its actual sunlight, and did what I always did, which was work hard and well and quietly. But something had shifted in me, some subtle recalibration, and instead of coming home and trying to explain my day to a wife who had already decided it wasn't worth explaining, I started coming home and just listening. Listening to Theo talk about a video he wanted to make. Listening to Ruthie explain, in exhaustive 9-year-old detail, the plot of a book about a dragon who was afraid of the dark. Listening to Denise complain about a difficult customer at the showroom, nodding, asking questions, being present, but no longer performing my own hopes and disappointments for an audience who had made it clear she wasn't interested in the show. I don't want you to think I stopped loving Denise that day. That's not what happened, and I think it's important I say that clearly, because this isn't a story about hatred. This is a story about the long, slow work of understanding, and about what happens when you stop asking someone to see you and instead simply become, day by day, someone worth seeing, whether they choose to look or not. Weeks passed. In my new role, I inherited a genuine mess. Corrigan Steel had grown fast over the previous 3 years, faster than its systems could handle, and Foster had promoted me in large part because the shipping delays and scheduling conflicts that had been quietly bleeding the company money were exactly the kind of problem I'd been solving in smaller ways for years without anyone noticing. Now I had the authority, and the responsibility, to fix it properly. I threw myself into the work the way a man throws himself into anything when the rest of his life has gone quiet. I redesigned our production scheduling from the ground up. I renegotiated 3 vendor contracts that were costing us more than they should have. I built out a training program for new floor hires that cut our onboarding time nearly in half. None of it was glamorous. None of it would make headlines. But every week, the numbers moved, and every week, Foster noticed. About 2 months into the new role, Foster called me into his office on a Thursday afternoon. He had a habit of steepling his fingers when he was about to say something he considered important, and he did that now. "Grant," he said, "I've been doing this a long time, and I've seen a lot of people get promoted who couldn't handle it, and a handful who could have run the whole company from day one. You're the second kind. I want you to know that." I thanked him, the way you thank someone for a compliment that lands somewhere you didn't expect it to, somewhere still tender. He went on to tell me that Corrigan's board was exploring an expansion, a second facility 2 counties over, and that he wanted me to lead the transition team, effective immediately, with a raise that, when he said the number, made me ask him to repeat it. I drove home that night with the same golden light pouring through my windshield that I remembered from the day of my first promotion, and I felt the same old instinct rise in me, the instinct to run through the door and share this with Denise, to watch her face change. But this time, I caught the instinct before it left my hands. I thought about it carefully, the way I now thought about most things involving her, and I decided, quietly, that I would not perform this one for her. I would simply live it. I told her at dinner, plainly, without ceremony, "I'm leading the new facility transition. Bigger raise. More responsibility." Denise looked up from her plate, and for just a moment, something crossed her face, something that might have been surprise, or might have been the beginning of an old habit of dismissal reaching for words it had used before. But this time she didn't say anyone could do it. She just said, "Okay. That's good, Grant," and went back to her food. And I realized, sitting there, that her silence hurt less than her words used to, because I had stopped needing her permission to feel proud of myself. It was around this time that Theo started struggling. It began small, the way these things always do. A dip in his grades that his teacher flagged in an email. A new group of friends I didn't recognize picking him up from school in a car that looked older than it should have been driven by a kid who couldn't have been more than 16. He grew quieter at dinner, then quieter in general, retreating into his room with the door shut, the kind of shut door that feels different from ordinary teenage privacy. Denise, to her credit, noticed too, and for a few weeks it became something we actually worked on together, comparing notes in the kitchen after the kids were asleep, trying to figure out what had changed. It was one of the only times in recent memory that we felt like a team again, and I clung to it, hoping it might be the thread that pulled us back toward each other. Then, on a Saturday afternoon in early June, I got a call from the Bellhaven Police Department. Theo had been picked up, along with 2 other boys, for shoplifting from the hardware store downtown, the same one that had been there since before I was born. My stomach dropped through the floor. I left work immediately, drove faster than I should have, and arrived at the small station to find my son sitting in a plastic chair, looking somehow both older and impossibly younger than 14, his eyes red, his hands shaking slightly in his lap. I want to tell you honestly that my first instinct was anger, hot and immediate, but it burned off quickly, replaced by something heavier and more useful, which was the memory of my own father, a hard man who had met every mistake I ever made with punishment first and questions never. I had promised myself, long before Theo was born, that I would not become that. So instead of yelling, I sat down next to my son in that plastic chair, and I asked him, quietly, what happened. And Theo, who hadn't said more than 10 words to me in weeks, finally broke, and told me everything. He told me about the new friends, about wanting to feel like he belonged to something after feeling invisible at home for months while Denise and I were, in his words, too busy being disappointed in each other to notice me. He told me he'd known it was wrong the whole time, that he'd almost put the item back twice, and that the moment the store owner's hand landed on his shoulder, he'd felt a relief so enormous it scared him, because some part of him had wanted to get caught, had wanted someone, anyone, to finally stop and pay attention. That sentence, too busy being disappointed in each other to notice me, sat in my chest like a stone for days afterward. Because it was true. Denise and I had been so consumed by the slow erosion happening between us that we had let our son quietly drown a few feet away, thinking he was fine because he was quiet, when quiet, in a 14-year-old boy, is so often the loudest warning sign there is. The hardware store owner, a kind, weathered man named Corbin Ash who had known my family for years, agreed not to press charges in exchange for Theo working weekends at the store through the summer to pay off the item and, more importantly, to learn something about consequences that didn't come from a courtroom. Denise and I sat Theo down together that night, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, we were united, not against each other, but toward the same goal, which was our son. We talked, really talked, about what had been happening in our house, about the tension neither of us had bothered to hide as well as we thought we had. Theo cried. Denise cried. I held them both, and in that moment, something in the three of us softened, even if the fourth person in that house, the marriage itself, remained as brittle as it had been for months. Over that summer, something quietly remarkable happened. Theo, working 3 days a week at Ash's Hardware, sweeping floors, restocking shelves, learning to cut keys and mix paint, began to change. Corbin Ash turned out to be exactly the kind of steady, patient man my son needed, someone who talked to him like an adult but never let him forget the mistake that had brought him there. By August, Theo was coming home with a kind of quiet pride I hadn't seen in him in years, telling me about a customer who'd complimented how well he'd matched a paint color, about Corbin teaching him to use the old brass cash register instead of the computer, just so you understand what you're actually doing. I started picking him up from his shifts sometimes, just the two of us in the truck, and those drives became some of the most honest conversations of my life. He asked me once, out of nowhere, staring out the window, "Dad, do you and Mom still love each other?" And I told him the truth, which was that I didn't know anymore, but that whatever happened between his mother and me, it would never change how much I loved him and his sister, and that some things break not because people stop caring, but because they forget how to show it to each other, and by the time they remember, too much has already grown up in the space between them. Meanwhile, at Corrigan, the new facility project was consuming enormous amounts of my time and energy, but it was also, quietly, becoming the proudest work of my professional life. I was managing a construction timeline, a new hiring pipeline, a completely new logistics network connecting the two facilities, and doing it all while somehow keeping the original plant running without a single missed shipment. Foster started bringing me into board meetings, introducing me not as his operations director but as the man who's going to run this expansion. I began to notice something in myself I hadn't felt in years. I liked who I was becoming. Not because of the title, not even really because of the money, but because I was watching myself solve hard problems and hold my family together through a hard summer at the same time, and neither one of those things required Denise's validation to be real. Denise, for her part, was going through her own quiet storm that summer, one I only partially understood at the time. The furniture showroom she managed was bought out by a larger regional chain in July, and though her position was technically kept, her role was hollowed out, stripped of the design consultations and client relationships she had spent years building, replaced with corporate scripts and sales quotas. I watched my wife come home night after night looking smaller than she had the day before, and despite everything that had grown cold between us, I felt for her, genuinely, because I recognized the particular grief of watching something you built with your own hands get repackaged and handed back to you as something unrecognizable. One evening in late July, Denise came home particularly late, and I found her sitting in the car in our driveway for nearly 20 minutes before she came inside, which was unlike her. When she finally walked in, her eyes were red, and instead of going straight to change out of her work clothes like she usually did, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table, where I'd been going over facility blueprints, and she said, quietly, "They gave my biggest client to someone else today. Someone who's been there 8 months. They said it was restructuring." I set down the blueprints. I didn't say I told you so, though God knows there had been moments over the previous months where a smaller, more wounded part of me might have wanted to. Instead I just listened, the way I'd been practicing all summer with our children, and after a long silence, Denise said something that surprised me. "I don't know how you do it, Grant. Keep going like nothing touches you." I told her the truth, gently. It touches me. It touches me every day. I've just stopped needing someone to notice that it touches me before I let myself keep going anyway. She didn't respond to that, not that night. But I noticed, over the following weeks, that she started asking me questions about my work again, small ones at first, careful ones, as if she were testing whether the door I'd quietly closed back in the spring might still open from her side. I answered honestly every time, without performing, without needing the old validation, just sharing my life the way you'd share it with anyone you respected. Slowly, something in our house began to thaw, not dramatically, not with any single grand gesture, but in the accumulation of small honest moments, the way ice doesn't melt all at once but gives way first at its thinnest edges. The true turning point came in September, on the day the new Corrigan facility officially opened. Foster had planned a modest ribbon-cutting ceremony, nothing extravagant, just company leadership, a few local officials, and a reporter from the Belhaven Gazette covering what was, for our small town, genuine economic news: 60 new manufacturing jobs, the largest local expansion in over a decade. Foster asked me to say a few words before the ribbon was cut, something I hadn't done since that regional conference years earlier, the one Denise had missed for showroom inventory. I invited my family, not with any expectation, but because it felt right that they should see this part of my life, the part that had quietly grown into something enormous while so much else around us had been breaking and mending. Theo came straight from his shift at Ash's Hardware, still smelling faintly of sawdust, standing tall in a way that made my chest ache with pride. Ruthie held my hand the entire time, asking 100 questions about what all the machines did. And Denise came too, in a blazer I recognized from years earlier, back when she used to dress for client meetings she was proud of. I stood at a small podium in front of maybe 80 people, the late summer sun warm on the back of my neck, the new facility gleaming behind me, and I talked, briefly and honestly, about what it meant to build something slowly, quietly, over years that nobody was watching, and how the people who do the unglamorous work, the scheduling, the logistics, the small daily corrections nobody claps for, are so often the reason anything grand is able to stand at all. I wasn't talking only about Corrigan steel when I said it, though nobody in that crowd but me and, I think, Denise, understood that. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and Theo helped Ruthie chase down a stray balloon from the small decorations table, Denise walked over to me alone. She stood there for a moment, not saying anything, looking at the new building, at the small brass plaque near the entrance that listed the leadership team, my name near the top. And then she said, quietly, her voice different than I'd heard it in years, softer, almost fragile, "I was wrong, Grant." I didn't say anything, not because I was trying to make her sit in it, but because I genuinely didn't know yet what I wanted to say. She went on. "I said anyone could do your job. I don't even really know what I meant by that. I think I was scared. My own thing kept falling apart, and it felt easier to believe yours wasn't special than to sit with why mine kept slipping through my hands. That's not fair to you. It was never fair to you." Her eyes were wet, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw not the flat, tired certainty from that spring afternoon in our kitchen, but something closer to the young woman I'd fallen in love with in that community college classroom, someone brave enough to admit when she'd gotten something wrong. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think real stories, the ones worth telling, don't pretend that forgiveness arrives instantly and completely, like a switch flipped in the dark. What I felt was complicated. I felt something in my chest loosen, some tightness I'd been carrying since that kitchen afternoon in spring finally easing. But I also felt, underneath it, the honest truth that an apology, however sincere, doesn't erase the months a person spends learning to stand up straight without someone else's approval. I told her that. Gently, but honestly. I told her I forgave her, and I meant it, but I also told her that something in me had changed this summer, that I'd learned to build my own sense of worth on ground that didn't depend on her opinion of it, and that I didn't think I could, or should, go back to needing her validation the way I once had, even now that she was finally offering it. Denise nodded slowly, and instead of getting defensive, which the old version of her might have, she said something that told me she had done some real growing of her own that summer. "That's fair," she said. "Maybe that's actually better. Maybe we both needed to stop needing each other for the wrong reasons before we could figure out if we still wanted each other for the right ones." We stood there together in the parking lot of that new building, the late afternoon sun stretching our shadows long across the pavement, and for the first time in a year, I felt like we were finally having an honest conversation instead of two people quietly keeping score. What followed wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation, and I think it's important I tell you that clearly, because I don't want to give you a false ending dressed up as a true one. Denise and I didn't fall instantly back into the easy love of our 20s. We started, instead, doing something slower and, I think, more durable. We began having dinner together after the kids were in bed, just the two of us, talking honestly about the years that had worn us down, about her fear of failure and how it had curdled into resentment she'd aimed at the wrong target, about my own tendency to disappear into quiet competence rather than ask for what I needed. We started seeing a marriage counselor in town, a soft-spoken woman named Priya Okafor who had a gift for asking the one question neither of us had thought to ask ourselves. Slowly, over the fall, something between us began to rebuild, not the same structure as before, but something sturdier, built with both of us finally being honest about the cracks in the old foundation instead of just repainting over them. Denise eventually left the furniture chain that had hollowed out her role, and using a small inheritance from her mother that she'd been too afraid to touch before, she opened a modest design consulting business, working from a small rented office above the very bakery in downtown Belhaven that had been there my whole life. It started slow, just a handful of clients, mostly people from town who remembered her old showroom work and trusted her eye. But I watched something in her come back to life that had been dormant for years, the same fire I'd fallen in love with, and this time I made sure, deliberately, consistently, to be the kind of husband who showed up for her small wins the way I'd once hoped she would show up for mine. I went to her first client open house. I told everyone at Corrigan about her business, sent clients her way when I could. Not to earn back anything, not as a transaction, but because somewhere over that hard summer, I had relearned what it actually means to build a life alongside someone instead of merely beside them. Theo finished out his summer at Ash's Hardware and, to everyone's surprise but perhaps not really, asked Corbin if he could keep working there part-time through the school year. He started talking, for the first time, about wanting to study business, maybe even run his own shop someday, like Mr. Ash, but with better music playing. The shoplifting charge, expunged after his community service and Corbin's letter to the court, became not a stain on his record but, strangely, the hinge point where my son had found his footing, the way sometimes the worst days of our lives turn out to be the ones that finally point us toward who we're supposed to become. Ruthie, blissfully unaware of most of the storm that had passed through her family that year, simply grew, the way 9-year-olds do, taller and more curious and utterly certain that both her parents were, despite everything, the two best people she knew. As for me, I want to tell you honestly what that year taught me, because I think it's the reason I'm telling you this story at all. I don't believe Denise's words that spring were set out of true malice. I believe they came from a wounded place in her, a place that had been quietly suffering for years while I, distracted by my own long climb, hadn't noticed closely enough to help her before the wound turned into bitterness. But I also learned that understanding why someone hurts you doesn't obligate you to shrink yourself to make their hurt make sense. I let success answer her that year, but not the way I imagine some people picture when they hear a title like that, not with triumphant vindication, not with some dramatic moment of proving her wrong in front of a crowd. I let success answer quietly, the way most real answers arrive, in the steady accumulation of showing up for my work, for my son, for my daughter, and eventually, once I had rebuilt something solid inside myself, for my marriage too, on terms that were finally honest for both of us. By the following spring, almost exactly a year after that afternoon in our kitchen, Corrigan Steele promoted me again, this time to Vice President of Operations, overseeing both facilities and a workforce that had grown by nearly a third. Foster told me, in that same steepled fingers way, that the board had specifically cited the human way you built this expansion as the reason, noting that under my leadership, not a single employee across either facility had left in the past year, an almost unheard of statistic in manufacturing. I came home that evening and told Denise plainly, the way I'd learned to tell her things now, without performance, without needing anything back. She set down the fabric swatches she'd been sorting for a client, walked over, and hugged me, a long, real hug, the kind we hadn't shared in years, and she said into my shoulder, "I'm proud of you, Grant. I mean that. Not because of the title. Because of the man who earned it." And this time, when she said it, I believed her completely, because I had watched her, over the past year, become someone capable of meaning it. If this story has touched something in you, something about the quiet ache of not being seen by the person who's supposed to see you clearest, or the long, patient work of rebuilding what's cracked instead of walking away from it, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Our community grows stronger every time one of these stories reaches someone who needed the reminder that it's not too late to grow, to forgive, or to be forgiven. And before we close this chapter, I want to ask you honestly, in the comments below, has there ever been a moment when someone you loved failed to see your worth, and what did you do with that pain? Did you let it harden you, or did you, like I eventually learned to, let it quietly become the ground you built something better on? I'd love to hear your story, because I think so many of us are carrying some version of that kitchen afternoon, waiting for the courage to answer it the way we deserve to. Looking back now, 2 years removed from that spring, I don't think of Denise's words as the worst thing that ever happened to our marriage. Strange as it sounds, I've come to think of them as the moment that finally forced two tired, drifting people to stop coasting on the assumption that love alone would hold a house together without maintenance, without honesty, without the daily, unglamorous work that success in any form, whether in a career or a marriage or a child slowly finding his way back to himself, actually requires. Anyone could do my job, Denise had said, and in the strictest, most technical sense, maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Someone else could have learned the systems, could have filled the title. But what she hadn't understood yet, what none of us fully understand until life forces the lesson into our hands, is that a job title was never really what either of us needed answered that day. What needed answering was whether I would let one careless sentence define how I saw myself, or whether I would let my own quiet, patient, unglamorous persistence become the proof that some things, the things that actually matter, whether it's a career, a broken trust, or a family standing at the edge of coming apart, are built by people who keep showing up long after anyone is watching. And that, in the end, is something not just anyone can do. That takes a particular kind of heart. I like to think, after everything, that I finally proved I had one. And more than that, I like to think I helped the people I love most find theirs too. Thank you for spending this time with me and with our family's story today. If kindness, forgiveness, and second chances mean something to you, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel, so more stories like this one can find their way to the hearts that need them. Until next time, take care of the people beside you, and take care of the quiet, unseen work you do every single day, because somewhere, someone is watching, even when it doesn't feel that way. And even if they never say it out loud, your work, your patience, and your heart are never as invisible as they sometimes feel.